postpartum anxiety and depression is pretty common. Like, I think it's like 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 women, something like that. Spence, do you know?
It's 1 in 5. I do think social media has done a really good job of giving moms the opportunity to really talk about the hardships that comes with being a mom. Whereas I feel like older generations made it like, oh, it's rainbows and sunshine and butterflies and it's just the most beautiful thing. And in a lot of ways it is, and in a lot of ways it's not. And so I feel like our generation is doing a good job of like, no, this is what it is. You're going to be tired. You're going to be sleep deprived. It's not always rainbows and butterflies. And so I do think that social media has given women the opportunity to really be like, kind of like brutally honest and give other women a heads up about what this really looks like.
Welcome back to the Heal Your Roots podcast. I'm Dr. Katie Manganello, and in light of May being Maternal Mental Health Awareness Month, I have Dr. Spencer Brown and Dr. Brianna Bliss, who are licensed clinical psychologists that specialize in maternal mental health, here with me today. So, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm so excited to have you guys here. They're also some of my friends on top of my colleagues. We went to grad school together, so this is really fun being able to include them in on this conversation and for them to share their wealth of knowledge with us on this. So, before we get into it, can you guys both just tell me a little bit about what kind of brought you into the field, not necessarily just the field of psychology, but also what kind of inspired you to do this type of work?
Sure, I guess I can start. So I think what originally sort of led me to like perinatal mental health was my focus on my dissertation. So that's when I really started to look into women's health. My dissertation focused on female infertility, stigma, cognitive distortions, and coping responses. And so once I really started to get into that, I was like, this might be a really good field, a really good niche for me to kind of explore. So that led me to my internship, which led me to my postdoc, which then led me to my full-time job right now. And so that's kind of like the trajectory of how I kind of got into the field, was really essentially my dissertation topic.
Yeah. And what kind of brought you to choose that topic again? Like, was there anything in particular that kind of like happened that sparked that?
Yeah, so it was during the time when The Handmaid's Tale was on TV.
Oh my gosh, yes! I remember this now, yeah.
So literally, I was just kind of like laying in bed and I was thinking about like, what do I want to do for my dissertation topic? And I just remember everybody saying, you don't want to pick something that's going to be boring because you have to like sit with it for like a year and a half. And I kind of already knew the foundation was going to be something related to like women's health. I didn't know what. And then I was watching The Handmaid's Tale and I was like, infertility. I think that would be like something that I would want to explore more and get into more. And so that's kind of how it kind of led me to it. And I also read the book in high school. So I had a good foundation for it.
I didn't know that.
I didn't either. Awesome.
Fun fact.
Yeah. Actually, I didn't even know there was a book. I thought it was just a show.
Me either.
Margaret Atwood. It's the author.
Awesome. Okay. And what about you, Dr. Bliss?
So I am a pediatric psychologist, and so I work in primary care with little kiddos 0 to 21. So I see the whole pediatric lifespan actually. And I'm in a pediatrician's office, and where I work now, I have over the past 2 years or so been starting to work with the younger, 0 to 5 kids. And obviously with that comes parents and moms. And so I kind of stumbled into perinatal mental health through seeing little kids. And what happens in primary care sometimes is moms are screened for depression or for, any other stressors or family stress. And so I love to see like newborns and when the moms, first have the babies, and so I can work with them then. or any of the caregivers really. So I kind of stumbled into perinatal mental health through my work in pediatrics. And I also do a group, a prenatal group for pregnant people, currently focused on the fourth trimester and newborn development. So mostly seeing kids, but have been working with perinatal population through my work in pediatrics.
That's awesome. Isn't it interesting how we just kind of like stumble into what we're doing? It's not just like, this is what I'm going to do, and here we are, right? So that's really cool.
I feel like that's my life. I feel like I kind of just stumble into things. It just kind of happens that way. So I just go with
Yeah.
Totally.
it. Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure.
I never really thought I'd be going into
Me
this kind
either.
of direction, but especially in primary care, it's all like preventative mental health. So it's like if you're gonna see a 2 year old or a 3 year old, then why not just start seeing the mom too, like as early as possible? So
That makes
just
sense.
kind of happens that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And a lot of working with children is working with parents. So, yeah, that it makes sense.
Definitely.
For sure.
God bless
Yeah.
you, because I don't want to work with the kids. I'd rather work with the moms. So,
It's fun. There's never a dull moment. They keep you on your
Never.
toes.
I know. You tell us.
It's true.
Well, so with that being said, and knowing that you both work with this, so how would you define postpartum anxiety and depression, and how would you kind of differentiate that from like a typical just like baby blues?
So typically with like the baby blues, just want to kind of like preface this that the baby blues are extremely common.
Mm-hmm.
About 85 up to about 85% of women will experience the baby blues. So this is essentially, feeling sad, feeling overwhelmed, feeling anxious during the first 2 to 3 weeks postpartum. If those symptoms do not start to decrease, but rather like increase or kind of like stay the same after that 3 week mark, then that's when we would be concerned about postpartum depression. So I always tell my moms that when they are pregnant and kind of like brace them for that because it's extremely common. And I'm always like, just because you're crying at the drop of a dime, you're feeling overwhelmed, you're anxious. In the first 2 to 3 weeks, that does not mean you have postpartum depression. You are in the baby blues phase. So I always kind of give that sort of like caveat in the beginning.
Yeah. And also with that, like that happens because of the drop in hormones,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
like right after your body during pregnancy is developing all these other different hormones that you don't typically have, and then you deliver, you give birth, and drastically we see this drop in
Yeah.
hormones, and that's why there are natural consequences or mood changes
Yep.
within those 2 to 3 weeks. So totally normal to feel that. Most people do feel that.
Yep.
And it's for a specific reason.
Mm-hmm.
But like, Dr. Brown said, if that continues past 3 weeks, then you want to talk to like your OBGYN or your
Mm-hmm.
doctor or someone, to get more support.
And I will say most OBGYNs are screening at the 6 week checkup postpartum. So I do feel like that is something that has been really helpful. And then that's how we kind of get involved as like perinatal psychologists, is that like a OBGYN will, send a referral to us, or the birthing mother will reach out to us because maybe she had like an elevated screening for depression.
Yeah, which is why it's super important to go to your 6 week postpartum visit.
Yep.
I know, like, sometimes moms, it's overwhelming and you put yourself on the back burner and you feel like you have a ton of pediatric appointments because you have a newborn, and so you're going to all your baby's appointments, which is fair, but also you still, need to take care of yourself because that's the best way to help your baby. And so it's really important to go to that 6 week checkup for just a variety of reasons to make sure like you're doing okay health wise and talking about your labor and delivery, and but also if there are emotional concerns, that could be a really good time to get screened and to talk to someone and maybe get connected to mental health treatment and get more support.
Yep.
Definitely. And so, as it relates to that timeline, so you had said that the first, like, so many weeks, it's common, it's more baby blues. Once it hits that point, then it's considered postpartum. When is it no longer, if the symptoms persist, when is it no longer considered postpartum and it's considered depression, anxiety, unrelated? Or is this something that kind of can last for a pretty long time after birth?
It really depends. A lot of people go by the 1 year mark. So in terms of 1 year postpartum is typically when we kind of say like postpartum depression ends. But really it really just depends on the woman and the symptoms of it. But typically it's up to a year postpartum.
Okay.
We would call it postpartum depression.
Gotcha. Okay. And so, what are some of the common symptoms of postpartum anxiety and depression? And, more specifically, how is it different? How does it show up differently from other types of anxiety or depression?
Do you want me to go, Brie, or you?
Go ahead.
So I would say in terms of like depression, so it really is kind of very similar in terms of the symptoms of just classic depression and postpartum depression. So obviously feeling really sad, feeling tearful, or like weepy, low motivation, lack of interest, not engaging with other people, but also not wanting to engage with the baby is like a big one. Classic like lack of sleep is a really big common symptom, obviously, because baby may not be sleeping, you're up at night. A lot of times it's co-occurring with anxiety, particularly with sleep, because mom may be very anxious about nighttime, having to watch baby, feeling like she needs to always have her eyes on the baby at night because of different risks that happen at nighttime and sleep. And so those are some of the common ones. And then, of course, suicidal thoughts, passive thoughts to harm yourself. I tend to see that related to when the mom is feeling like inadequate in some way or feeling like she's not being a good mom. And so then having those feelings of wanting to escape or run away because she's feeling like she's not being a good mom or feels inadequate.
So it sounds like they're more, it's the same kind of symptoms, but more so just focus on the baby and her
mothering.
A mother.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah, okay. Bree, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't know if you said also like irritability and feelings of anger, right? That could look like, both depression and anxiety.
Yep.
But yeah, basically similar symptoms, loss of interest in doing things that you once used to like to do, right? But more so because of, this experience of having a baby and caring for the baby. And anxiety tends to be like all about the baby,
Yeah.
So
right.
Like worrying about the baby, just having those anxious feelings, feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes panic attacks can occur in postpartum period because of anxiety. So yeah.
Right. And I think that it might be hard for someone to know if they're experiencing this or not without going to these appointments they're supposed to be going to, because it's normal, like you said in the beginning, like to an extent, to be worrying about your baby, right? Like it's now your job to keep your baby alive and to want to be a good mom and all of that kind of stuff. So that really does kind of highlight the importance of them going to those kinds of appointments.
Yeah.
Okay. So talk to me a little bit more too about what you know about risk factors, or is there certain family history that kind of influence these things, or certain things that happen during birth maybe that could be risk factors to these things?
So I guess first of all, like postpartum anxiety and depression is pretty common. Like I think it's like 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 women, something like that. Spence, do you know?
It's
1 in 5.
Will experience a perinatal mood or anxiety disorder of some sort. Yeah.
Right. That's pretty common. And so like people might be wondering, well, how do I know if I'm going to be 1 in 5, or,
Yeah.
what factors, what risk factors, do I have, and that would make me more likely to experience postpartum mood disorder? I think definitely family history, right? So if you have anyone in your family that has experienced depression or anxiety, or specifically also postpartum depression or anxiety, if you yourself have ever experienced anxiety or depression, that makes it more likely to
Mm-hmm.
experience that during pregnancy. Um, there's a lot of like social factors too, right? So if you have limited social support, or maybe, not, not the social support that you would like nearby, maybe friends or family are distant,
Mm-hmm.
that could be a factor. Financial resources can be a really big factor.
Yeah.
Lacking financial resources.
Yeah.
What are some of the other ones, Spence? I know you know.
Yeah, so in particular, like women of color are also at a higher rate of developing perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. Women of color are 2 times more likely than white women to develop a PMS disorder, and 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth. And so, like, risk factors are really huge. And so, having that knowledge and really kind of advocating for yourself, getting more information, asking questions is something that can really be helpful during pregnancy and postpartum as well.
That is
Yeah.
alarming.
It is.
Yeah.
We're definitely in a crisis right now in terms of this.
Right.
Yeah.
And what do you do in your roles to advocate for that and kind of like make changes around that? Because really that is scary. And I think a lot of people don't know that.
So I think one of the biggest things is talking to like OBGYNs and making sure that they're like culturally competent, and being sensitive and really being aware of, this information, and being really supportive and open to listening to women of color when they have questions, because a lot more women of color are aware of this. And I do think that that does play a role in like some of their hesitance, because even though this risk is really high, women of color do not often seek treatment for this, whether that's because of like stigma, whether that is because of like fear, um, of like providers. Um, there are just like a multitude of reasons why, and then also specifically like institutional like racism and things like that, um, obviously come up when we talk about this issue. So it can be a lot of different reasons.
Yeah, I was gonna say that speaks to like access of care. Like I work in a predominantly low income area in New York City, and predominantly like Black and Brown population. And so one of the things that we try to do is increase access to care for all those reasons that Spencer just shared, because of the stigma, because of, there's not, where I work, very low financial resources available to people. So trying to give people access through their OBGYN, access to mental health services, screening groups, where they can
Mm-hmm.
learn about perinatal mood disorders and learn
Mm-hmm.
how to like know the signs for postpartum anxiety and depression, know the risk factors, so that they can have conversations with their doctors. If their doctors aren't asking them, they can bring that up and
Yep.
say, this is what I'm feeling, like this is what I need to talk about. So I think, yeah, all of that is really important to make sure we address.
Yeah, and I also think having like providers of color, whether that's like OBGYNs or therapists, psychologists, I think that can also reduce some hesitance of bringing some of these hard conversations up, as if you can prepare maybe with your therapist before, like, well, what should I say? What questions, should I be asking? What should I look out for? I think all of that can be helpful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. Yeah. And so, in talking about these risk factors, and a lot of what you're saying that you do is giving people the education around the risk factors and what
Mm-hmm.
could come up, how do you feel like that helps from a prevention lens?
I think people like so knowing the difference between baby blues and perinatal mood disorders, sometimes in my experience, like the women I've worked with, they're not really sure what baby blues are, or how, if they have these risk factors to get a mood disorder. So just have giving them the tools to know what to look for and what they might be feeling, I think is super important because then they can advocate for themselves in a
Mm-hmm.
system that like won't always help or advocate for them. So I think that's really important just to give them the knowledge and the education to know like what I'm feeling and what I need to ask for. And this is when I need more help.
Mm-hmm.
Or this is okay, this is normal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I echo everything Brie just said. And also, just like with anything, the more knowledge you have, the more information you have, the better equipped you are to kind of face it or overcome barriers because you kind of can know what to do and have more resources at your fingertips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it certainly sounds like it helps a lot in at least in healthcare, right? And that also just kind of is a segue for me thinking about how this impacts so many aspects of a woman's life, or right? Like it obviously impacts them in their health, but also can you talk a little bit about how it impacts their relationships with people, their relationship with their baby, relationships with partners, family, all of that?
I think one of the biggest things that I have seen come up, and I was like really not aware of this when like just being just like a regular person, but becoming like a psychologist and working in this field, is how often people do not talk about like gender roles within their relationship and like what that is going to look like when they have a child.
Mm.
And I think that is a big source of stress in a relationship. Like, am I going to be a stay-at-home mom? Am I going to be a working mom? If I'm going to stay at home, is it then my responsibility to take care of the child 24/7? And then what is my partner's role in that? And so I think gender roles is a really big issue and can be a role sort of like transition within itself, becoming, especially for first time parents, it can be like a really huge source of stress. Just kind of throwing it out
Definitely.
What are
there.
some what are some examples of that? I'm really curious about of like how that shows up.
So, like, for example, so let's just say the woman is like a stay at home mom. She may feel a lot of responsibility to be the one to take care of the baby 24/7. Because if she's a stay at home mom, then typically, let's just say her husband is the one who goes to work. And so she may feel a lot of guilt or shame to have to then ask her husband to wake up in the middle of the night to get the baby because she's the stay at home mom. And her role is to take care of the child. And so I think having these conversations, in pregnancy or before you decide to have a child can definitely shed a light onto like, so is this going to be really truly 50-50, or is this going to be more 60-40, 80-20? And if you can decide that, and everybody sort of like be somewhat okay with that, it can reduce a lot of stress because you might go into it thinking like, oh, we're partners and my husband is going to be in this 50-50, but really it may look more like 60-40. And that's okay as long as you can kind of prepare for that and plan for that kind of early on versus now we have a newborn and I'm up and I'm breastfeeding and I have to keep getting up and my husband is just sitting there snoring and sleeping. That causes a lot of resentment and some anger, sometimes because you're constantly the one waking up and quote unquote responsible for the child. So that is something that I have seen come up so much. That's why I kind of wanted to just throw it out there.
Yeah, no, that's a good example.
Yeah.
So you're saying everyone try to like put out there what the expectations are and,
Yes.
and originally and
Yeah.
then
If
not
you
have
can.
resentment if you can.
if you can, like, especially like if you know, like, we're planning to get pregnant, that can definitely be something to kind of talk about. Like, so what are your expectations? Like, what do you think this is going to look like? You know,
Mhm.
like when the baby comes, because often it doesn't look like what both of them thought originally. So you have these, you both are coming into it with expectations, regardless if you talk about it or not. But if you talk about it, at least you can prepare for it.
That's good advice.
Thank you.
Yes.
Um, I also, to answer your question too, Katie, I wanted to talk about the mom baby relationship, like how that's impacted with attachment, because that is a lot of what I talk about in my role at my job too. Um, there's a concept called serve and return. I don't know if you guys have heard of this concept. So it's kind of like a tennis match, you know? So
Mhm.
compare it to that. So, like with attachment and newborn babies, you think of like the baby serving up like a gesture, like a babble or a cry or something, and then the mom returning that serve. So, like in tennis, you know, you hit it over, you hit it back, right? Serve and return. And so, when we talk about like moms who are experiencing postpartum depression or anxiety, it can make it really hard to return that baby's babble or bid for like attention or need or cry, if mom is kind of experiencing her own emotions. So it's super important because whenever we have that serve and return interaction between mom and baby or any caregiver and baby, the it's like so important for brain development. So the baby's brain is like millions of neurons are firing, right? And it's learning so much in such a short period of time. And whenever there's like, you know, the baby laughs and the mom serves that back and laughs too, that neurons are like going crazy, firing, and they're making that bond and that connection together. So if we think about moms who are like, you know, struggling with depression and not able to laugh with their baby or pick their baby up when their baby's crying because they're going through their own emotions, that could really impact the bond, of course, the attachment, but also the baby's, you know, the way the baby's brain is developing too, because
Mhm.
they're really looking for that attention and that secure attachment from the caregiver. So I think from like a neuron level all the way up to like attachment, it's so important when we think about when moms have postpartum anxiety or depression because it really can impact like the baby's development and their secure attachment.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that really quick in terms of like the bond, I think there is a huge misconception that women have in terms of feeling like I'm going to be bonded to my baby as soon as I see them. Like this
Yeah.
is a
Yeah.
huge misconception. And so when that bond is not there, it definitely leaves women to feel like inadequate or like there's something wrong with me. I don't feel bonded to this child. And so something that I like to tell my moms kind of when that does happen is like this is like any other normal relationship. Like when you met your partner or your husband, you might not have, you know, liked or loved him right away. It may have took, you know, some time, a couple of weeks. And so think of it like any other normal relationship. It may take time for that bond to really grow. Like baby loves you regardless, but you know, this is like any other relationship. And so give yourself that time to have that bond really like flourish. And so like breastfeeding is a really good way to increase bonding time, and skin to skin is a really good way to increase bonding and attachment, and specifically like in those early stages. But it may not happen right away like a lot of women think.
Mhm. Yeah, that
It's
makes
such a good
sense.
point. I feel like media, social media, it's all portrayed as like you're just gonna instantly fall in love with your baby, right?
Yep,
But
yep.
that's not always the case.
I will
Right.
say, since we brought up social media, that I do think social media has done a really good job of giving moms the opportunity to really talk about the hardships that comes with being a mom. Like if just following different women. A lot of women out there that are on social media are really like doing a good job of like talking about, no, it's hard to be a mom. Like,
that's what I'm seeing.
yeah. So
That's what I'm seeing on social media. Yeah.
I will say that I feel like millennials like us and like Gen Z moms are really like doing a good job of telling the harsh truth about being a mom. Whereas I feel like older generations made it like, oh, it's rainbows and sunshine and butterflies and it's just the most beautiful thing. And in a lot of ways it is, and in a lot of ways it's not. And so I feel like our generation is doing a good job of like, no, this is what it is. You know, you're going to be tired. You're going to be sleep deprived. It's not always rainbows and butterflies. And so I do think that social media has given women the opportunity to really be like kind of like brutally honest and give other women a heads up about what this really looks like.
Good points. You know what else I'm really curious about is, we talk a lot about partners and maybe even like parents or the grandparents of the babies, and obviously the relationship with the the baby and the mom. But I'm really curious about how giving birth to maybe a second or third or whatever child impacts a relationship with the mom and their other children. Like, is that something you guys ever see or talk about with people? I don't know if that's really relevant to your work, but I'm curious about it.
Oh yeah, for me in pediatrics, because sometimes I'll be seeing like a 2-year-old and they're jealous of the newborn baby, and you know, the parents can only do so much, if the mom is one person, and so that does come up a lot. So sometimes like, well, how do I cope with this adjustment of having this second baby when the first one is not a fan? So we work through that, and sometimes it means like developing like special time with mom and the 2-year-old like one-on-one so that they can still feel valued, and just other different strategies that we talk about. But that is very much a real thing. And it really just depends on your child if they're going to have that reaction. Some kids are
Mm-hmm.
perfectly excited and
Mm-hmm.
like take on a big brother or sister role, and it's great. So it really just depends.
Yeah.
I would say for me, in terms of like what I do, a lot of times women will have an expectation because they already have a first child and already had a first pregnancy, and that pregnancy went really well. And then they get pregnant a second time, and it's not like that. And then so there's a lot of like comparisons of, well, this experience was like this, but this experience is not like that. And so really getting them to stop making those comparisons and letting them know, like, each pregnancy is going to be different and come with its different challenges, and each baby is going to be different and have different challenges. And so, kind of setting that foundation can
Yeah,
be.
that's a really good point.
Yeah.
That's interesting, actually. Also, I want to circle back to, because when I brought up the relationships, I was talking about like potential like grandparent relationships and stuff, and you kind of giggled, and I want to know what you were thinking. I said that. Yeah.
Well, in terms of like grandparents, so if it's let's just say it's the mom and it's her parents, a lot of times, and even like mother-in-laws can give unsolicited advice.
Right.
And so I think it can be really hard on the mom, particularly like if it's a first pregnancy, when like your mom is like, oh, well, I have 5 kids, you only have one. It can be really hard to kind of like manage that. It can feel very like undermining in a sense of like, well, what I'm going through is not hard enough, or I should be kind of like grateful in a sense. And so I think like older generations, it can be, kind of like grin and bear it, like it's not
Yeah.
that hard. And so it can really impact the postpartum period when you kind of feel like you're being judged or criticized because you only have one child or 2 children. And the older women in your life are like, oh, kind of get over it. Or if they even don't even feel like postpartum depression exists, oh,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to feel tired, you're going to feel, maybe sad, like it's going to be okay. And so it again kind of leaves the woman feeling like inadequate and so
Yeah.
so that can be hard.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Like from generation to generation, right? Like
Yeah.
as we've gotten more open about mental health and it's
Yeah.
less stigmatized, although it still is, but
Yeah.
maybe grandparents they don't see postpartum anxiety or depression, or
Yep.
they didn't have that experience, or if they did, they weren't gonna talk about it or weren't aware of it.
Yep.
So that's a really different challenge just generationally to
Yep.
even like meet eye to eye on that and understand what's going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, in-laws and grandparents do come up a lot in this way, especially mother-in-laws. But that's a different conversation.
Yeah, I feel like we could have a whole other podcast on that. Not even just the mother-in-laws, but just like parents of the new parents, and like cultural changes too. As that, it's not just generational in the sense of like, well, I'm a millennial and they're a whatever, but also just knowing that like, at least in America, this might be a really interesting dynamic that's different. I don't know if it's different in other countries, but like, a lot of our parents or grandparents are, first generation, second generation, and the differences that kind of come with that, that's really, I think, an interesting thing. But you're right, that would probably be a whole other podcast. We should probably table that one for now.
That'll be next time.
I was going to say, just have
next time.
I have so many ideas now.
I know.
Send them over. I get very excited about all the ideas too. But bringing it back to this one, so we already talked about how, like, let's talk about how we can help the new moms, right? Like, what are we going to do? So you talked a lot about psychoeducation, giving them information about all of this, the advocacy piece, and being able to have them advocate for themselves as well as your work in advocating. Tell me more a little bit about like other treatment options once it's established that, okay, there is postpartum happening here. Like, what kind of treatments do you use? What kind of treatment options are there? Like medication, individual therapy, support groups, maybe couples, like those kind of things.
Yeah, so all of those things that you named.
I just answered the question for her. Just say more about them though. Like, what does it look like?
So obviously, kind of like we said, like, so if we take it all the way back to the beginning, like screening tools. So then we get the referral, they meet with us. So obviously we do like the intake and all of that. So essentially, if I see a woman for several sessions and I feel like her symptoms are not really, getting better or decreasing, then that's when I would have the conversation in terms of like medication. And so I will often say, like some people can do really well with just therapy alone, but a lot of people do really well with therapy and medication. And so then I talk to them a little bit about like, how do they feel about medication? Because one of the big sort of misconceptions is that when I'm pregnant, I have to come off all of my medication. And that is not accurate. It's important for a lot of times for women to stay on their medication, depending on what the medication is. I'm not a psychiatrist by any means, but a lot of times when the woman comes off of all of her medications, we really see a drop in her mood. And then all of those symptoms really come back with a force during pregnancy. And so then they come to us and they're really distressed. And then we have to then manage that and kind of say, okay, let's get you back on your medication because that was what was helping you during this time. And so I think that's a big piece of it. And then if they've never been on medication before, talking to them about how they feel about being on medication. A lot of times women don't want to start medication because of breastfeeding. And so then that's when I would send them to a perinatal psychologist a psychiatrist, who can really talk to them about what medications are really safe for breastfeeding. And I know just offhand, a big one that a lot of perinatal psychiatrists recommend is Zoloft because it is pretty safe for breastfeeding.
I do think that is a big pressure that people feel without knowing that they have to go off of medication when they're pregnant.
Mm-hmm. But obviously talk to your psychiatrist when you are, pregnant, because some medications may have different side effects and different risks, but it's important to get that information and not just assume that I have to come off of everything because I am pregnant. And some OBGYNs don't even like to prescribe to pregnant women, which then is another huge problem, because then it's like, okay, now I don't have access to my medication because my OBGYN doesn't want to prescribe to me, because they're afraid, to do it during pregnancy. But that's why we have perinatal psychiatrists now, because they
That's so
specialize in
important.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Even if your OBGYN doesn't want to prescribe it or your primary care physician doesn't want to prescribe it,
Yeah.
don't give up hope. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean that you can't get it. It just means that they don't want they don't see you often. And
Yeah.
so when a provider's not seeing you like weekly or every other week, they can't monitor how the medications are going. So it just might mean you see a psychiatrist or, a therapist who can get you connected with a psychiatrist um, to get the right medication. So if at first you don't succeed with the right provider, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Just have
Hmm.
to figure out the right person
Yeah.
who's going to be able to work with you over time to make sure that like once you start taking these medications, they can like observe you and make sure things are going okay.
Okay.
And then also in terms of like couples work, uh, concerns do come up during therapy when just working with the woman. Obviously, we are not couples counselors. So I do talk to my women. We do talk about like the stressors and the relationship dynamics. But I will often refer to like a couples counselor, because I'm just working with one half of the equation. The partner also needs to be involved, because what I will often say is that when you are in therapy, you are going to get better, have a lot of knowledge, but your partner is essentially staying the same. And so then how is that going to work? If you now have all of these different tools, but your partner's staying the same, it's not really going to
Mm-hmm.
work. And so having a support person who can see both of you and talk to both of you and talk about like the communication, I think can be really helpful.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and I think beyond like a therapist, a psychiatrist, other kinds of therapy, couples counseling, I think it's also really important to connect to community resources. So that's a big focus in the group that I run. Like things, resources like doulas,
Hmm.
maybe like a Healthy Start program, which they have in a lot of, it's a national program. So they kind of have like visiting nurses that can help moms, or they provide you with a doula. They can give you access to formula, diapers. So there's a lot of programs out there that can be of like concrete support that
Yeah.
people might need, rather than just like emotional support, which is really obviously very helpful. But sometimes if you're struggling with finances or like any other social factors, it could be really good to have a support in like a doula or just know where to
Hmm.
get diapers or
Yeah.
a food pantry, things like that. So sometimes when you connect with a therapist, they can also have access to those resources for you. So it's important.
Hmm.
Awesome. Do you have any other just kind of general or practical advice for, it doesn't even have to be like a mother struggling with postpartum depression or anxiety, but any kind of new mothers? Do you have any kind of advice for just how to kind of like cope with the typical changes that are happening?
I just feel like this is such a huge transitional period. So there is going to be ebbs and flows that naturally kind of come along with that. But you are doing a great job. You are a good mom. And so the fact that if you are concerned that you may not be doing a good job says that you are a good mom. Because if you didn't care, then we would have pause for concern. But if you are questioning that, then you are definitely being a good mom.
Yeah,
Yeah.
being gentle and nice to themselves.
Yeah,
Some
being
self compassion.
yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And I would say to add to that, you will have bad days,
Hmm.
and that's normal and that's okay. And that
Hmm.
doesn't mean you're a bad mom. It just
Hmm.
means you're human. And sometimes, like we talk about this a little bit in my group, it's like balancing your thoughts, right? So if you're saying to yourself, like, this is really difficult, maybe you could balance that out with, like, and I'm doing the best I can, right?
Yeah.
So you can just kind of think about little ways to balance out your thoughts because sometimes when it weighs too heavy on one side of the scale, that's when we can start feeling kind of down. So I think it's about balance, knowing you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have the bad days, having the bad days, and tomorrow will be better. So,
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, do you have any final statements or pieces of advice or anything that you would want to leave us with regarding any of the things that we had talked about today?
I feel like that pretty much covers it, but I will say, just look out for me and Dr. Bliss in the future. We have some things up our sleeves, so just keep an eye out for the two of us in
for
the
all
future.
your maternal and child wellness needs.
100%.
Okay, Dr. Bliss, do you have anything?
That pretty much sums it up.
Okay, amazing. Well, this was so fun. Yes, we definitely have to do this again. And yeah, we'll all definitely come up with some more ideas. So
100%.
thank you so, so much for joining us today. And for everybody out there listening, please remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode wherever you find your podcasts.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Of course. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.